Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped round Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. She turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was him. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Then Mary went to the others with the news, "I've seen the Lord."
Well, this is an Easter day like no other, certainly like no other in my lifetime. I've already said that this morning, and I guess that you've said it or heard it said several times in recent days. Like I said to Linda, Christ is risen, let's all stay at home, doesn't quite have the ring to it that we expect from our Easter declarations. And if I'm honest, from the outset of beginning to put these worship gatherings together, today has always been in my mind. What on earth do we say? How on earth do we say it on Easter Day? Now, maybe you took part in the Sing Resurrection initiative this morning and have already stood on your doorsteps and sung the Easter hymn to your neighbours. And yes, that's one way of declaring that Christ is risen. But as we remain in lockdown, as we stay in isolation, how do we live and speak as a resurrection people? You know, one thing that I've said a number of times in recent weeks is that as I've looked at the gospel narratives in our present circumstances, I'm continually surprised by how relevant they seem to be to what we're facing and going through. And perhaps, if you think about it, that shouldn't surprise us. Because for those first Christian disciples, those who ran to the tomb, who tried to process and make sense of the scene that they found when they got there, a lot of its consequences were lived out, frankly, in lockdown. Yes, they may have rushed to the tomb on Easter morning, but in the evening we read that the doors of the house where the disciples were locked for fear of the Jews. Now, there are plenty of theologians who've told me the significance of this locked door. This tells us something about the resurrection body of Jesus. This tells us that the new Jesus can't be contained by locked doors or bolted windows, that Jesus can come and go in ways that we physically can't. And I don't doubt that any of that's true. But I also, as I look at it, don't think that that's the reason that the disciples locked the doors. I can't see Peter getting together with the others and say, "Look everyone, let's lock the door, bolt the windows, and then if Jesus turns up, when John comes to write the gospel, he can show everyone that Jesus isn't contained by these things." They shut the doors. They bolted the windows because they were afraid. They were afraid of what might happen to them if they came into contact with strangers. Does that sound familiar? And a few weeks later, on the day of Pentecost, where do we find those first followers of Jesus? Together in one place, staying in social isolation because of the threat of the world around them. But Jesus was alive. And I can imagine that those first disciples on that Easter day and the days that followed would have said very similar things to the things that we find ourselves saying now. Wow, that was a Passover like no other. They too would have had their religious routines. Some of them, maybe like Jesus, had been taken as youngsters to the temple and seen something of the festivals there. Maybe some of them were regulars and went every year. But they did know the script. They knew what to expect. And as they had absorbed everything that was going on, especially in relation to the death and resurrection of Jesus, yeah, this was a Passover like no other. It was a Passover like no other because Jesus had injected a new reality into the narrative. But I don't think they would have realised that at the time. All of the hopes and the promises that are contained in the Psalms and the hymns of their traditions were being fulfilled in Jesus. But it took them time to work that out. The narratives that we read today, the stories of Easter and resurrection, were put together a couple of decades later. At the time that those events took place, they simply had to work through the reality that faced them. And like us, they had to discover what it meant to declare that Jesus is alive in their everyday circumstances. You know, in many of our churches today, had they been open, someone like me would have stood at the front and would have pronounced to the congregation, "He is risen." And the congregation would have responded, "He is risen indeed." Now, because we're Baptists, it would have probably taken a couple of rehearsals because we don't do liturgical responses very often. But that would have been that. He is risen indeed. And off we would have gone into singing all our favourite Easter songs with full gusto. And we can do that because we've got 2,000 years of hindsight to draw on. 2,000 years that we can recite in 4 words. He is risen indeed. And there are reasons why we should do that. Because it stamps an affirmation on every experience, every success, every struggle in our shared history as God's people. And it stamps an affirmation on our tomorrow and the day after and the weeks after that, as we continue our own discipleship journey. He is risen. He is risen indeed. And that is a refrain that we need to hear echoed over our current circumstances. But let me take you back to that garden, the one we read about in John chapter 20. Because that's not how those first disciples experienced it. Early on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene did not go rushing up to the empty tomb, find the stone rolled away and announce, "He is risen," while all the other disciples filed into rows in front of her and pronounced, "He is risen indeed." No, their Easter morning was nothing like the one that we're used to. Mary was afraid and confused when she discovered that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. Her first instinct was one of horror, that even in death, the body of her beloved Lord had not been left to rest in peace. In the midst of death, she felt robbed of the usual rituals and expressions of support that matter hugely to us in times like that. And so she ran to find Peter and the other disciple, not so that they could share in the glorious revelation of the risen Christ, but because she was shocked and upset and desperately needed the support of her closest friends. We can look at that empty tomb now and shout, "He is risen." But the church's first cry on Easter morning was, "They've taken him away from us. We don't know where Jesus is." And then Peter does the most typically human thing. What do you do when someone tells you something has happened? "Okay, Mary, if they've taken his body, I'll go to the authorities and I'll find out what on earth's gone on and sort things out." No. Peter goes to look for himself. How often do you do that? I certainly do. Somebody tells me something, somebody tells me a set of facts, and I go off and try and have to find those facts out for myself. And all I do is discover exactly what they've already told me. And when Peter does arrive at the tomb, he's as confused and bewildered as Mary. Only one of the three of them is able to muster a glimmer of optimism. The other disciple, we're told, he believed. But we're not even sure what he believed, because we're also told that they did not know the scriptures that he must rise again. So the two male disciples leave the garden, one confused and the other prepared to believe that God is doing something over and above what the immediate circumstances suggest, but not really sure what. And the story goes on to tell how Mary stays in the garden. And there, alone, she meets Jesus. Why didn't Jesus turn up when Peter and the other disciple were there? Why couldn't he be there for the three of them? Because the disciples also needed to learn to trust and include each other's stories in their own. And so Mary is the one through whom they're given that first opportunity to believe. I wonder if we sometimes miss these human elements in the Easter morning story. Its big truths are absolutely critical to our faith identity. They're vital if we're to make sense of the church's story ever since. But they weren't discovered by reciting a creed or singing a hymn. They were discovered in the trauma and confusion of a world which for the early disciples had been turned upside down. Those who first discovered that Jesus was risen were traumatized. You don't stand in the audience of a Roman execution party and come away emotionally unscarred. And you certainly don't remain unaffected when the person who's been crucified is the one individual that you believe in more than anyone else in the world. You know, a couple of things have come my way in recent days, reminding me that we as a nation and indeed as a world community are also traumatized at the moment. We're living in an ongoing state of disruption and fear and uncertainty, and that ongoing reality will be having an impact on us all. And the question that we bring today, I guess the question that underlies your desire to participate in this online gathering is, can I discover and know that Jesus is alive in the midst of this trauma? Can I be as convinced that Jesus is alive in these circumstances as I would be if we were following our usual routines? And the answer that screams back at us from those confused, chaotic events of Easter morning is an emphatic yes. This was no carefully planned worship ritual. It was a group of frightened, confused people just following and trying to live with reality and follow their instincts into the middle of all of that. And into the middle of all of that, Jesus injected this profound truth. I am alive. That's why this was a Passover like no other. It was a Passover like no other because they had probably never experienced anything like the trauma of that weekend. Sure, they may have seen and heard the odd Roman execution, but these things always happen to other people, not to our closest and dearest friends. And it was a Passover like no other because hot on the heels of that trauma and struggle, they now needed to absorb an even more profound truth. Jesus was alive. And we can't separate these two realities, the trauma and the discovery. You know, if Mary had come rushing from the garden the week before to tell the disciples Jesus is alive, then they'd have said, well, of course he's alive. Why wouldn't he be alive? The power of the statement is rooted in the trauma of the 3 days previous. So perhaps the disciples needed 6 weeks in lockdown to get their heads around it all. So what can we learn from these traumatized, confused disciples on that Easter morning? What can we learn from them that can help us make sense in our lockdown? First, embrace reality. Yes, we can laugh at Peter rushing to the tomb, even though Mary had told him exactly what he was going to find there. But Peter ventured even further into that reality. He went inside, which is why we read a bit more of the detail. The body may be gone, but the grave clothes are still there. And our way through the coming weeks is not to sit in isolation wishing that things were different. It is to embrace this earthly reality, to not run away from it, but to acknowledge it so that God can speak to us in and through it. Second, believe. The other disciple was open to the fact that no matter how weird and inexplicable the situation was, God could be in it. But they also needed to believe each other. It was Mary's testimony that took them to the Garden of Discovery, and it would be Mary's later testimony that would help them make sense of it as she declared, "I have seen the Lord." Which takes me to the third thing. Learn to recognise Jesus in the events before you. It was the most logical thing in the world for Mary to assume that when a man came across and stood near her, that it was the gardener. But she engaged. And again, it was her sorrow and struggle that was the means through which she engaged with this apparent stranger. And it was then, in her honesty, that she discovered that it was Jesus who was with her. Don't look so much for explanations from God in the present circumstances. Look for his presence. If God feels like a stranger, be honest about your struggles, and you might just discover that he's closer to you than you think. Jesus is alive. He hasn't left us with a set of instructions or explanations. He has promised to be with us, uncontained by bolted doors and locked windows. And finally, live it and share it. They told each other. They came together, and as they shared each other's lives and stories, so again and again they discovered the deeper reality that Jesus was alive and that Jesus was with them. So we live in lockdown, but Jesus is alive. We live in the midst of bereavement and loss, but Jesus is alive. We're robbed of our usual rituals and routines, but Jesus is alive. We may be feeling afraid and vulnerable, but Jesus is alive, and we're concerned for loved ones in key roles in the front line. But Jesus is alive. We don't know when this will end or what the world will be like when it does. But Jesus is alive. There is so much more for us to take in and to get our heads around. But Jesus is alive. So yes, let's recite that well-known Easter affirmation. He is risen indeed. But not out of glib routine and ritual, but because in the midst of a whole new landscape, we've discovered that this is true. Christ has died. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed.